Last night, they dropped the Comic-Con extended trailer. Well, technically that's not true. I'm recording this a week or two after I wrote that. Regardless, we got some great news about one of the best dragons in the dance. My favorite dragon of them all, Caraxes. The largest dragon during the dance was Vhagar. She was enormous. Caraxes was said to be half of her size, but since Vhagar was so big, that description implied that Caraxes was also a huge dragon. In fact, he was described as being a, quote, huge and formidable beast. That term is very subjective, but I had always envisioned Caraxes as being around the size of Drogon at the Field of Fire. Look at this big boy. That is a huge and formidable beast. So far, we've seen a couple shots of Caraxes, and he is big, but not that big. But there is good news. There is a new shot of Prince Daemon and Miss Arya on Caraxes. That is a valuable piece of information because it tells us that this is probably Caraxes around the time that Daemon stole a dragon egg. That event happened around 24 years before the dance. For reasons that I'll get into in the next video, the show appears to be changing the timeline, so this shot here might be just 15 years before the dance in the show. But the point still stands. Since Miss Arya is on Caraxes with Daemon, this event takes place in the past. In other words, Caraxes is presumably going to get even bigger for the dance. The same thing is true for Caraxes. So far, we've seen several shots of Caraxes and she's tiny, but these shots are all from the past. She is going to grow for another 15 years or so in the show adaptation of the story, so Caraxes is going to get a lot bigger by the time of the dance. Here's a fun fact. Both Caraxes and Caraxes were described as being, quote, huge and formidable beasts, despite the fact that Caraxes is a much older dragon than Caraxes. Let's actually take a step back so that we can put these two dragons into perspective. Nearly 100 years prior to the dance, Princess Rhaena placed a dragon egg into the cradle of her younger brother Jaehaerys. 2 years later, she did the same thing to her younger sister Alysanne. Those eggs hatched and grew into the dragons Vermithor and Silverwing, so those two dragons were nearly 100 years old during the dance. Dreamfire was actually a few years older than them, and Sheepstealer was not much younger. So 4 of the dragons during the dance were nearly 100 years old. The next oldest dragon was Caraxes. Caraxes was first ridden by Rhaenys' father, Aemon Targaryen, in 72 AC, so Caraxes was at least 57 years old at the start of the dance. Good Queen Alysanne had told King Jaehaerys to place an egg in Aemon's cradle in 55 AC, so Caraxes might have been as old as 74 years at the start of the dance. 55 to 74 years old. That is part of the reason why he is so big. He was an old dragon. On the other hand, Caraxes was described as being a young dragon when Rhaenyra first rode her at 7 years old in 104 AC. We don't know when Caraxes hatched, but that implies that she was anywhere from 26 to 31 years old at the start of the dance. So Caraxes was a much younger dragon than Caraxes, but they were both described as being, quote, huge and formidable beast. So they were in the same ballpark in terms of size. Nevertheless, they aren't going to look the same. As you can see in this picture, Caraxes has a very long neck. The showrunners probably did this because Caraxes was described as being, quote, lean. The main takeaway is that both this shot of Caraxes and this shot of Caraxes are happening in the past. It is very likely that we are going to see a much bigger version of Caraxes by the end of Season 1, and fingers crossed, Caraxes is also going to get much bigger. In the next House of the Dragon video, we're going to finally address the timeline changes.